In the darkness of a small room, a simple dream that had once blossomed was quickly crushed by the cruelty of fate. A young Myanmar woman left her homeland with a heart full of hope, only to step into a strange land and face a nightmare with no way out. A place that should have been the future turned into a terrifying prison. Behind closed doors, the cold truth gradually emerged. But what happened in that year plus? And why did her unjust death shock an entire nation? Let's take a look into the darkness of 2015, where a tragedy began to unfold. The story takes place in Singapore. According to Singapore's 2023 population report, the country's total population has now reached 5,176,000 people, of which permanent residents, simply understood as a person who is not a citizen of a country but has the right to live and work legally in that country for a long time, are only 538,600 people. The non-permanent population is 1,684,000 people. The non-permanent population is mainly a large number of foreign workers, of which the proportion of foreign maids accounts for about 15%. That is, those who we often call maids. Foreign domestic workers in Singapore mainly come from three countries: Indonesia, the Philippines, and Myanmar. And our story today begins with a Myanmar woman with a dream, preparing to go to Singapore. Piang Ngaih Don is a 23-year-old single mother. In order for her family to have a better life, in 2015, she resolutely left her homeland, alone to work in a strange Singapore, hoping that through her own efforts she could change the fate of her whole family. This decision was difficult and uncertain, but she was still full of hope for the future. She was born in 1992 in a remote village in Chin State, Myanmar. Her parents were both farmers, while Myanmar's economy was very backward at that time. Chin State was one of the poorest states in Myanmar. Her village was located in the mountains, 70 kilometers of muddy mountain roads from the nearest town. You can imagine how difficult life was there. For them, having a full stomach was the only wish. The whole family often had to go hungry. The main reason was that the family had too many children. Her parents had 11 children. Piang Ngaih Don was the third. The family's life was already extremely difficult, and misfortunes continued to strike. When she was 4 years old, her parents passed away one after another. The burden of making a living for the whole family fell heavily on the shoulders of her very young siblings. Over the next 10 years, her 5 younger brothers and sisters passed away one after another, mainly due to hunger, cold, and illness. Although she had the opportunity to go to school at the age of 15, Piang Ngaih Don had to drop out of school and return home to work in the fields because there were still many younger siblings who needed care. In the following years, she was always busy with farm work. At the age of 18, she met and fell in love with a boy from the same village. In 2012, before getting married, Piang Ngaih Don became pregnant with her boyfriend's child. Having a child before marriage would have been a complete joy, but that bad boy did not want to take responsibility and ran away. Although her family was very poor, Piang Ngaih Don did not want to abandon her biological child. The following year, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy and became a single mother. The life of the mother and son was extremely difficult. To earn money to support her children and family, she started doing odd jobs, carrying loads at construction sites near town. It was a very hard job and the pay was not high, but due to circumstances, she had no other choice. During her time working, she happened to hear that the salary in Singapore was very high. The monthly income was at least 3 to 4 times higher than her current income. Many Myanmar women came to Singapore to work as domestic helpers so that their families could have a better life. Piang Ngaih Don, an uneducated woman who had never traveled far, decided to try her luck. She thought that she could do all the jobs of a maid. Her plan was to work in Singapore for about 3 years, earning enough for her to return to Myanmar to build a new house and buy land. She also discussed with her siblings to send her son to her sister to take care of. The whole family supported her decision. After all, this was a way out. After making up her mind, Piang Ngaih Don began to prepare the necessary things to go to Singapore. Because she was still 2 months away from turning 23 years old and did not meet the minimum age requirement for foreign domestic workers in Singapore at that time, she had to spend some money to have someone correct her birth date earlier 2 months. After obtaining a passport, Piang Ngaih Don set off for Singapore in May 2015. For this country, which is much more developed than Myanmar, Piang Ngaih Don felt that everything was new and full of hope for the future. In Singapore, Piang Ngaih Don went through professional training, registration, and a series of other procedures before officially becoming a maid, waiting to be hired. She was quickly recruited by a family. The homeowner was a 35-year-old housewife named Gaiyathiri Murugayan, with 2 children, a 4-year-old daughter and a son who was just a few months old. For such Singaporean families, hiring a maid was the best option. In fact, she had previously hired 4 maids, but for unknown reasons, all of them eventually did not stay long. Piang Ngaih Don was the 5th maid hired by this family. Gaiyathiri's apartment was located in the central area of Singapore at Building 145 Road 11, Bishan. This was a 3-bedroom apartment, which was considered quite spacious in Singapore, a place where land is scarce and people are crowded. Of course, in addition to her and her 2 young children, Gaiyathiri's husband, Kevin Chelvam, a 37-year-old Singaporean police officer, and her mother, Prema 57, were also at home. In addition, there are 2 other tenants in the house. Including Piang Ngaih Don, there are a total of 8 people living in this apartment. On May 28th, when Piang Ngaih Don first stepped into this apartment, she knew that she would be spending a year or more here. This would be her home in Singapore. Here, we need to add a little. In Singapore, in addition to paying and buying insurance for the maid, the landlord also has a very important obligation to provide accommodation. It is understood that the maid will live in the employer's home, just like a family member. However, the living conditions of domestic workers are often not very good. In many cases, they are not even considered rooms. The owner will provide a very small warehouse, or simply set up a temporary sleeping place. Looking at the number of people living in the Gaiyathiri family, it can be seen that Piang Ngaih Don's living conditions are certainly not good. Her main duties are to take care of 2 children, clean the house, cook, and do other odd jobs. It can be said that she does almost everything. Although it is very hard, but for someone who has been used to hardship since childhood like her, these tasks are nothing. In the following days, Piang Ngaih Don only knew how to work hard, trying to complete everything as perfectly as possible. However, she soon began to feel that something was wrong. The landlady, Gaiyathiri, was very strict. She was always very demanding in everything, such as complaining that Piang Ngaih Don ate too much, worked slowly, worked uncleanly, etc. She almost never smiled, which made Piang Ngaih Don feel depressed and unhappy, far from what she had imagined. But since she had decided to come here to earn money, she had to endure it. After all, there is no easy money to earn. To avoid angering the landlord, Piang Ngaih Don had no choice but to work even harder, trying not to leave any openings for scolding. But it didn't seem to work, because no matter how hard she tried, she was still scolded every day. More importantly, not only Gaiyathiri but also her mother, Mrs. Prema, joined in supervising and disciplining her severely. At first, the mother and daughter just scolded, but over time their tricks escalated. They didn't even let Piang Ngaih Don use a phone and didn't give her any time off, including her leave, which was 1 day off per week as required by Singapore law. In order to earn more money, Piang Ngaih Don reluctantly agreed to work overtime. She hoped to quickly save enough money and return home in glory. By October, although Piang Ngaih Don had become more and more docile, almost obedient to all the requests of the landlord, the outrageous thing was that Gaiyathiri and her mother not only did not restrain themselves, but also became more and more brutal. They no longer limited themselves to verbal abuse, but began to beat her regularly every day, many times. Despite this, Piang Ngaih Don still endured. This stemmed from her childhood experiences. Her difficult childhood had taught her to endure. However, her tolerance only made Gaiyathiri and her mother become more and more brutal. They not only slapped her, pulled her hair, but also punched and kicked her, and even used various tools to torture her. Once, they even used a hot iron to press on her hand. In addition to being physically attacked, Piang Ngaih Don's life was also strictly controlled. Every day, she was only allowed to sleep for 5 hours, had no rest during the day, and was only allowed to eat leftovers and bread soaked in water. She was even restricted from going to the toilet. Under the sick torture of the Gaiyathiri mother and daughter, Piang Ngaih Don became increasingly emaciated, and her spirit began to panic. During a health check in October, the doctor discovered many scars on Piang Ngaih Don's body. Gaiyathiri explained that the maid often worked clumsily and fell many times, which caused her to become like that. Gaiyathiri's husband, Kevin, also reported that the maid had many problems, but when the authorities suggested changing the maid, he refused. Piang Ngaih Don herself did not inform the agency about what she had suffered. Therefore, the matter was buried. She also missed the best chance to escape the devil's den. Time passed until July 26, 2016, which was the 14th month since Piang Ngaih Don started working for this family. Early that morning at 7:30, Gaiyathiri found Piang Ngaih Don lying unconscious on the floor, not getting up to work. She angrily shook Piang Ngaih Don, but she did not react at all. At this time, her mother, Mrs. Prema, also came running. The two tried everything but still could not wake Piang Ngaih Don up. Thinking about what happened the night before and early this morning, the two began to panic. At 9:30 a.m., Gaiyathiri called a doctor named Quan Hui Shi, saying that someone in the family was injured, and asked for a doctor to come and examine her immediately. However, Dr. Quan was busy with a patient at the time and could not come immediately, so she advised Gaiyathiri to call an ambulance. However, Gaiyathiri refused and insisted on waiting for Dr. Quan to arrive. At 10:50 a.m., Dr. Quan finally arrived. After a preliminary examination, she determined that Piang Ngaih Don was dead. Based on the body temperature, it could be seen that the victim had died some time ago. Hearing this, Gaiyathiri looked worried and lied. "Impossible. I saw her move just now." As a professional doctor, Dr. Quan immediately realized that the family was lying. When she looked at Piang Ngaih Don's emaciated body, she knew for sure that there was something unusual in this story. Therefore, she asked Gaiyathiri to quickly call the police. However, Gaiyathiri hesitated and did not call the police. Instead, she called her husband, Kevin, to inform him of the situation and asked him to come home. Realizing something was unusual, Dr. Quan was forced to report it to the police himself. At 11:26, the medical staff arrived before the police. The forensic staff performed an autopsy and discovered a shocking truth. They said this was an unprecedented case in their professional history. The victim, Piang Ngaih Don, 24 years old, was emaciated. Her body weighed only 24 kilograms, just skin and bones. She was severely malnourished. With such a weight, even a normal person would have difficulty surviving, let alone having to do housework regularly. According to the medical examination records dated May 28, 2015, when she first arrived at the employer's house, she weighed 39 kilograms. Thus, in just 14 months, her weight had dropped by 38%. In addition, her body was covered with wounds, with at least 31 new wounds and 47 old wounds. There was a burn mark on her right arm from an iron. Her neck was almost completely bruised, and her hyoid bone was broken. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation following severe neck trauma. Looking at the autopsy results, everyone can realize that Piang Ngaih Don had to endure brutal torture for a long time before passing away. Police immediately arrested Gaiyathiri and her mother, Prema. Her husband, Kevin, was also arrested a few days later. Prosecutors charged Gaiyathiri and her mother with first-degree murder. As for Kevin, because he had an alibi at the time of the crime, he was not charged with first-degree murder. However, given that Piang Ngaih Don had been abused for a long time without Kevin taking any action to stop it, he faced charges of causing serious injury and was suspended from work. Because the incident occurred in a house with no witnesses, and the defendants denied the crime, claiming that they had never beaten or scolded the maid, there was a serious lack of evidence, making the investigation very difficult. However, the unexpected happened. After the case was exposed and caused a big stir in Singapore, a citizen provided the police with an important piece of evidence: a hard drive containing surveillance camera data. It turned out that her husband, Kevin, who was a police officer, had installed several cameras in the house. The initial purpose may have been to monitor the maid and children, but in the end, these videos became the strongest evidence to expose the truth. During the search for the surveillance camera hard drive, there was another noteworthy detail. Kevin initially told the police that he had removed the camera in early 2016 at the request of the tenant. However, after investigation, the police discovered that the camera removal was done after the incident occurred. He feared that this evidence would be unfavorable to his wife and mother-in-law, so he deliberately destroyed the evidence. Because of this action, Kevin also faced charges of perjury and destruction of evidence. After police examined the hard drive, they discovered data from June 21, 2016 to July 26, 2016, just before the murder. The recorded videos revealed the unimaginable level of brutality of mother and daughter Gaiyathiri and Prema towards Piang Ngaih Don. In it, they not only continuously tortured her physically, but also took control of her daily life in a sickening way. Although the content of the videos is difficult to watch, investigators have attempted to summarize some of the highlights. On the evening of June 21st at 9:58, for unknown reasons, Gaiyathiri suddenly took a bottle of cold water from the refrigerator and poured it directly on Piang Ngaih Don's head. On the morning of June 24th at 7:51, while Piang Ngaih Don was ironing clothes, Gaiyathiri walked over, hit her on the head and left. Immediately after, she returned, holding a hot iron and pressing it against Piang Ngaih Don's forehead, then continued to press it against her right arm. On the afternoon of July 13th at 4:30 p.m., Gaiyathiri claimed that the kitchen and floor tiles were not cleaned properly, so she dragged Piang Ngaih Don into the kitchen, cursed at her, slapped her in the face, and punched her in the stomach. At 00:26 on the morning of July 15th, Gaiyathiri dragged Piang Ngaih Don to the window and tied her to the bars with a rope. Although Piang Ngaih Don begged her to let go, she paid no attention. Piang Ngaih Don was tied up all night and was only released at 5:41 the next morning. In fact, from July 15th to July 26th, for 12 consecutive days, Piang Ngaih Don was tied to the window bars and slept on the cold floor. Occasionally, Gaiyathiri would viciously splash cold water on her. Furthermore, through surveillance videos, it can be seen that Piang Ngaih Don never had enough to eat. Every day, she was only given bread soaked in water or a little leftover food. This was the reason why she was so skinny. Not being able to sleep, not being able to eat enough, and having to work continuously caused Piang Ngaih Don to fall into a state of physical and mental exhaustion. The last night of her life went like this. At around 11:40 p.m. on July 25th, when Piang Ngaih Don was washing clothes, Gaiyathiri thought she was working too slowly and rushed in to beat her. She punched and kicked Piang Ngaih Don in the neck and pulled her hair. Under the fierce blows, Piang Ngaih Don staggered at the toilet door. Gaiyathiri did not stop, continuing to hit her head until Piang Ngaih Don collapsed to the ground. When she saw that Piang Ngaih Don could not stand up, she called her mother, Mrs. Prema, to come and help. The mother and daughter poured cold water from the toilet directly on Piang Ngaih Don, but she still did not respond. Instead of calling for help, they dragged her into the room and kicked her in the stomach, forcing her to wear wet clothes and sleep on the floor, her hands tied to the window bars. Piang Ngaih Don was completely exhausted, only weakly begging, "Please give me something to eat. I'm so hungry." But even this simple request was cruelly refused. At 0:11 a.m. on July 26th, Gaiyathiri suddenly walked towards Piang Ngaih Don, kicked her in the stomach, and reminded her to pay attention to the alarm clock so she wouldn't forget. At 4:57 a.m., Gaiyathiri woke up and called out to Piang Ngaih Don, but did not hear back. She went closer and saw that Piang Ngaih Don was still motionless. Enraged, she kicked Piang Ngaih Don in the head and neck, grabbed her hair and pulled hard, but Piang Ngaih Don did not react. This was when the forensic experts determined that Piang Ngaih Don had died from suffocation after being brutally tortured. Even after realizing that Piang Ngaih Don was dead, Gaiyathiri and her mother did not call an ambulance, but continued to pour cold water on Piang Ngaih Don before leaving her there and going to sleep. The next morning, Kevin also saw Piang Ngaih Don but thought it was normal and went to work as usual. The surveillance footage provided incontrovertible evidence of the cruelty of Gaiyathiri and her mother. Based on each of the recorded acts of abuse, the police laid at least 115 charges, including abuse and causing grievous bodily harm. However, prosecutors decided to pursue only 28 of them to focus on the most serious acts. With the clear evidence from the surveillance cameras, the trial of Gaiyathiri and her mother, Prema, should have been a fairly smooth one. However, the process was not as easy as expected, as both defendants sought to have their charges dropped. First, both Gaiyathiri and Prema claimed that they were mentally ill and that their condition was very serious. To clarify this issue, the prosecutors immediately appointed specialists to conduct psychiatric examinations on both of them. The examination process lasted for 4 years, ending in April 2020. The final conclusion was that both of them were indeed mentally ill. Gaiyathiri was diagnosed with 2 conditions. One was obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which means that people with this disorder often have an excessive need for order, neatness, and perfection. They are too attentive to detail, pursue perfection, and set high standards for themselves and those around them. The second condition is postpartum depression, with symptoms such as persistent moodiness, fatigue, crying easily, irritability, and frequent feelings of mental suppression. Psychiatrists believe that these 2 conditions made Gaiyathiri aggressive and dangerous, which ultimately led to Piang Ngaih Don's death. As a result, Gaiyathiri's first-degree murder charge was reduced to involuntary manslaughter. This means she will not face the death penalty, which carries a maximum penalty of life imprisonment. Because she is a woman, she is also exempt from caning under Singapore law. On 23 February 2021, Gaiyathiri's trial officially opened at the Singapore High Court. Faced with clear and undeniable evidence, Gaiyathiri was forced to plead guilty to manslaughter and 27 charges related to ill treatment. The defense argued that Gaiyathiri suffered from multiple medical conditions and that her condition had worsened after a miscarriage in February 2016. They argued that what she had done was not intentional and asked the court to consider reducing her sentence to 14 years in prison. However, the prosecutors argued that what Gaiyathiri had done was extremely cruel and unacceptable, causing public outrage. Moreover, during the process of torturing Piang Ngaih Don, she was completely conscious, had a clear purpose, and knew exactly what she was doing. Therefore, the prosecutors requested the most severe sentence, which is life imprisonment. The verdict was originally scheduled for April 29th. Perhaps fearing a life sentence, Gaiyathiri struck a new trick. She changed lawyers and again negotiated with prosecutors, hoping to have the manslaughter charge reduced from first degree to second degree. If successful, the maximum sentence she could face would be 15 years in prison. On June 22nd, the trial resumed. Gaiyathiri's new lawyer asked for a lighter sentence of 8 to 9 years in prison, arguing that Piang Ngaih Don was also at fault for not cleaning the house properly, which had aggravated the defendant's condition. He also said that the 4 previous maids had not been abused. However, prosecutors rejected these arguments completely. Finally, after considering the opinions of both sides, the judge made the final decision, sentencing Gaiyathiri to 30 years in prison. The judge stated that no words could describe the level of brutality of the defendant in this case. Therefore, a severe sentence was absolutely necessary. However, considering the defendant's mental illness, a sentence of 30 years in prison was appropriate. If there is no element of mental illness, the court will certainly not hesitate to impose a life sentence. Although Gaiyathiri appealed several times, giving various reasons for reducing her sentence, all were rejected. The judges who heard her appeal said that she had shown no remorse for Piang Ngaih Don's death. The only thing she did after her arrest was to use her mental illness to get a reduced sentence. As for Gaiyathiri's mother, Prema, she faces 50 charges, but has also been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Prema's trial officially began on September 9, 2023. Prosecutors called her actions shocking and reprehensible and asked for a sentence of 14 to 16 years in prison. However, the defense attorney cited several reasons, including the defendant's illness and difficult circumstances, to mitigate the sentence. Ultimately, the judge found the defendant's actions to be too cruel and sentenced her to 14 years in prison. In addition to Prema's 14-year sentence, she also faces another charge of intentionally destroying evidence. This stems from her asking Kevin to remove the surveillance cameras in the house and hide the hard drive after the incident. Police discovered that after removing the cameras, Kevin gave the hard drive to a friend for safekeeping. However, the friend decided to hand the hard drive over to the police, thereby exposing the whole truth. For this action, the judge sentenced Prema to an additional 3 years in prison. Thus, her total sentence is 17 years in prison. As for Kevin, although he did not directly participate in the abuse of Piang Ngaih Don, he was clearly aware of what was going on in the house. Not only that, he also stood by and watched as his wife and mother-in-law abused the maid without intervening. According to a witness's testimony, Kevin sometimes appeared to approve or ignore their brutal behavior. Prema, in some of his statements, even hinted that Kevin had also participated in the beating of Piang Ngaih Don. But these statements were contradicted by other evidence. Ultimately, Kevin faced 5 charges, including perjury, destruction of evidence, and intentional infliction of injury. However, Kevin's trial has not yet concluded, and he is currently suspended from work. Piang Ngaih Don's case has shocked Singaporean society. Her death has sparked outrage not only in Singapore, but also around the world. Many humanitarian organizations and individuals have called for better protection of the rights of foreign domestic workers. The Singapore Humanitarian Economic Migrants Organization initiated a fundraising campaign to support Piang Ngaih Don's family. Within 6 days, the amount raised reached 200,000 Singapore dollars, about 150,000 US dollars. The organization later announced that the entire amount would be transferred to Piang Ngaih Don's family. Piang Ngaih Don's family in Myanmar was devastated when they heard the news. Her sister told the media that Piang had to leave her hometown to work to earn extra income for her son and family, but did not expect such a tragic end. Piang Ngaih Don's son lost his mother forever. Her brother later traveled to Singapore to bring Piang's body back to the country. The family erected a cross in front of their house to remember Piang Ngaih Don. This case is not only a wake-up call for Singaporean society, but also for the world about the risks that foreign domestic workers face. According to 2023 statistics, the number of foreign domestic workers in Singapore has reached 237,100 and is on the rise. However, repeated cases of domestic worker abuse have raised concerns about their rights and working conditions. In order to calm public opinion and prevent similar incidents, the Singapore government has issued a series of reform measures, including strengthening supervision of employers, improving the reporting system for domestic workers, implementing home visiting programs, and improving the quality of regular health checks. These measures have brought about some positive results, but cannot change the fact that foreign domestic workers remain a vulnerable group. Piang Ngaih Don's story also reflects a deeper problem, which is her mentality of resignation. Although she had the opportunity to ask for help, such as when calling home or during health checkups, Piang Ngaih Don chose to remain silent. The psychologist analyzed that this was related to her background and experiences. Born into a poor family, Piang Ngaih Don was accustomed to patience and resignation since childhood. Her inferiority complex and desire to please others made her afraid to speak up in the face of injustice. In the end, her obedience and patience became the reason for the landlord to become more and more brutal. The tragic story of Piang Ngaih Don is a reminder to all of us. In a society ruled by law, when faced with danger, we must decisively use the law to protect ourselves. Never wait for luck, because that can lead to heartbreaking and irreversible consequences. Her death has become a symbol of the fight for rights and justice for foreign domestic workers, a group that is often overlooked in society. Human rights organizations around the world have used this case as a call for increased protection for migrant workers, especially women from the risk of exploitation, abuse, and even murder. In Singapore, in addition to the reforms that followed the case, there has been much public discussion about how to monitor and handle similar cases. Some have suggested that regulations for families who hire domestic workers should be tightened, including increased regular checks and harsher penalties for even minor abuse. Doctors, lawyers, and immigration officials have also been encouraged to play a more proactive role in detecting and reporting signs of irregularities in migrant workers. Piang Ngaih Don's story is also a harrowing lesson in the indifference of others. During the 14 months of her abuse, Piang Ngaih Don shared a house with 2 other tenants. They must have heard or seen the brutal acts every day, but none of them spoke up or tried to help her. The tenants were then widely criticized by the public, who saw them as symbols of indifference and irresponsibility in society. A small movement arose, urging people not to remain silent when witnessing violence, no matter who the victim was. The incident also sparked debates about monitoring the mental health of migrant workers. Piang Ngaih Don was not only deprived of her basic rights, but also had no channel to share her problems. Many human rights activists have proposed setting up hotlines to protect domestic workers and provide timely legal and psychological support to prevent similar tragedies. Piang Ngaih Don's family, despite receiving a large amount of support from the fundraising campaign, still has no way to make up for the pain of losing a loved one. Her young son, now living under the care of relatives, has grown up without his mother. In an interview, Piang Ngaih Don's sister shared that the family always prays for her soul to rest in peace and hopes that no one else will have to endure the pain her sister went through. Documentaries, articles, and books about Piang Ngaih Don's case have been made to raise awareness about migrant workers and domestic violence. Many Singaporeans have changed their attitudes towards domestic workers since the incident, treating them more humanely and respectfully. However, activists say that real change requires not only legal reforms, but also a shift in awareness and culture. The case of Piang Ngaih Don is a heartbreaking reminder of what can happen when brutality meets indifference. It shows that no one should have to endure injustice and violence just because they belong to a disadvantaged group in society. At the same time, the story is a powerful call for each individual to speak up and act when they see injustice, so that tragedies like Piang Ngaih Don's never happen again. Really grateful if you give your opinion below in the comments section to help us understand you better, as well as improve the videos Day One better. See you in the next video.